This week, we'll be talking about some recent racist incidents and how churches are responding with Pastor Clark Pfaff. He's the lead pastor at Valley Brook Community Church in North Granby, Connecticut, one of the founding pastors of Thrive Farmington Valley, which if we have time, we'll touch on, and a founder of Granby Racial Reconciliation. Clark, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me, Charles.
And so, Clark, maybe just to get folks started who may not know you or Valley Brook, can you give us a little bit of your bio and maybe a little bit about Valley Brook too?
Sure. I had pastored for 13 years in Minnesota when I sensed a call to church planting. And I went through a church planting assessment center, and I was recommended for church planting. And then this church in Connecticut, of all places, called me and said that they would like to interview me. And we began that process. And so we moved here in 1999. We launched Valley Brook in 2000. And we've been going strong ever since.
No looking back.
No looking back.
And were you from the Midwest originally?
No, actually, I was born and raised in North Carolina.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that. Okay.
Yes.
And so Valley Brook has been around. This is your
24th year.
24th year. That's great. Congratulations.
Yes.
And for folks who maybe, not from Connecticut, don't know where North Granby is, can you kind of place them geographically for folks?
Yes. We're about 15 minutes outside of Hartford, probably 20 minutes outside of Springfield, Massachusetts. We're west of the airport in Connecticut. And if you have ever noticed, the northern boundary of the state of Connecticut has a notch in it. We are directly below the notch.
And so now you're also the founder of Granby Racial Reconciliation. Can you give what is that? How did it get its start?
Sure. Well, during 2020, during the pandemic, when George Floyd was murdered, along with the other Black folks that we saw that were killed in various situations, the pastors of Granby, Connecticut began to talk about, what can we do? And so it was really a group of pastors from Granby who said, we need to come alongside our friends of color and say, what can we do? And so we started meeting, and we started planning, what we could do. And one of the first things that we decided we would do, honestly, was because most of the pastors in town were white, was that we needed to invite some people of color to join us. And so we did that. So Granby Racial Reconciliation is not a distinctively Christian organization. We've had to, invite folks in who are not Christians. We even have some input with Jewish people. So it's really become something to deal with the need for racial reconciliation in Granby, but the greater Farmington area.
And so what are some of the things up until recently? I do want to get to the more recent incident, but what have you guys been doing up until now?
We began with something we called courageous conversations. So again, this was in the middle of the pandemic. And so we would meet at a local city park, and where we could be outdoors, and we met at a pavilion, and we would have conversations about race. It was led by one of my good friends, Ken Moaning, who's an African-American man. And we would have just honest conversations about race. And I watched light bulbs go on for a lot of white people who came because, they didn't know many things that a lot of us don't know growing up in a white dominant world.
And so a lot of times what we've observed is we say honest conversations, or we say hard conversation, but it ends up being hard or honest for only one side. Were you guys able to get past that and really have honest conversations that challenged everybody?
We were. One of the things we said early on, it's not the responsibility of our friends of color to educate white people. We really pushed on them to learn for themselves. And one of the things that was really instructive for me back in 2017, after the Charlottesville protest and riots, was reading a book called Waking Up White by Debbie Irving. She's grew up north of Boston and had a very similar white upbringing to me. And when I read her story, I saw so much, and it really educated me on things that I honestly was just ignorant as a white man. And so it really helped me. And so that was important for us in those courageous conversations. And it was, there were tense times. There were folks who pushed back on some things, and we had some folks who were very conservative and white and struggled with some of the things that we were talking. And and we had honest conversations from our Black friends who said, I won't go running in this town because I don't know what'll happen. And just sort of eye-opening, shocking, and sometimes painful realizations.
And so you're doing these courageous conversations until this more recent. So had you done other stuff too, or was that really the gist of it?
No, that we did other things. So we intentionally began to do something around Martin Luther King Day. We would pick one of the significant quotes from Dr. King's, one of his speeches or sermons, and we asked the churches in the local synagogue to make that a part of their Martin Luther King weekend service. And then we would take those messages and we would post them on our website, GranbyRacialReconciliation.com, or RRGranby.com. I can't even remember. That one's the hard one for me, even though it's the short one. And so we did that around Martin Luther King Day weekend. Every year around the anniversary of the murder of George Floyd, we have a vigil in the town green. We started a Juneteenth celebration, and that has been great. We've been very intentional about inviting artists of color, whether they are artists who are singers or some other performer, or whether they have artwork that they want to promote. Or this year we had a bookseller who was one of the Black businesses in the area. So we invited them to come. And so that's been really eye-opening. We've had choirs come and sing at those events. We've also done some online Bible studies on race, and we have done some book reading discussions also.
And so it sounds like at least one of the primary things that you've gotten out of it so far has been an increased level of understanding for at least some of the people who are involved in it.
Yes.
And
yes.
Are there other outcomes, friendships forming that are kind of crossing those boundaries, or what kind of other outcomes are you seeing or are you hoping for?
Definitely, relationships being built across racial lines. Even, I think, enlightening some of our elected officials in the town to help them understand the part of their community that they don't really know. And, we've really tried to be a grassroots level to meet everyone. And so I would tell you, and I think one of the things that I struggle with is sometimes we do tend to reach a lot of the people who are already convinced of the need for racial reconciliation. But I think the longer that we are there and the longer we continue to have a presence, the more people will understand that there is a disconnect oftentimes, particularly in a white dominant community, about what it means to be a person of color.
Because there is a challenge in that this has been so wrapped up in politics,
yes,
and so agenda driven,
yes,
that it is hard for the average person to separate out what's actually true and useful, and versus what somebody's take on it. And I've certainly found in my own experience, you get past a lot of that if you're just friends with somebody, because you can trust your friend to tell you the truth, right?
Yes.
And you may not agree with it, how they perceive that truth, or but you can understand where you get a better understanding of what they're dealing with and where they're coming from.
Yes.
As opposed to somebody has an agenda, right?
Yes, definitely.
And so at this point, this has been going on for a few years.
Yes.
And now something recent happened. And so can you tell us about this?
Yes. Last month, October of 2023, many of us woke up on a Saturday morning to find a flyer from a white supremacist group had been tossed into our driveways, and they were recruiting men of European descent. Obviously, that's code word for white men, to join a movement and to resist those people who were trying to take over our country. And so I was shocked. I reached out to my friends on Granby Racial Reconciliation. I'm the chairman of it, and we all realized that we needed to do something. And very quickly, we planned a rally called Stop the Hate Rally that we actually were able to put together in a week's time. So the flyers were distributed in town one Saturday, and the very next Saturday, we had the Stop the Hate Rally. And then, go ahead.
Sorry, let's back up to the flyers a little bit. So now, how did you know that this wasn't just a couple of kids in poor taste throwing it on 5 driveways? How did you determine the source of it, the scale of it, all that kind of stuff?
A couple of ways. Number one, obviously I was shocked when as I read it. I'm going, wow, I can't believe this is here. So I obviously looked around my neighborhood and said, wow, almost all my neighbors have one of these. And then curiosity got me, so I started driving streets in the neighborhood. I reported it to the local police, and then they reported back to me eventually that there had been streets all over the town of Granby that had received them. Not every street, but that had been prolific. And then what we began to realize as we did some research is that this was not an isolated incident in Granby. It had been happening in other towns throughout Connecticut and Massachusetts and Rhode Island this fall.
And so they're calling on white men, basically,
yes,
to specific actions, or was it more vague to just stand up and be white more or something?
It's vague. They want to connect, and they very clearly said, we want to resist. They don't define what resist is, but then they, were very clear. They gave websites and email for making connections. So, that was clear. They wanted people to check them out and to respond to that.
And I'm not sure that it actually matters, but just in researching it, did you find them to be then neo-Nazis, Klansmen, right? What brand
yes.
of hate would they?
Well, it's interesting. In Massachusetts, they're branded as neo-Nazis. I would say that was probably pretty accurate. Neo-Nazis. It is always interesting to me that we've seen, this is not the first hate group we've seen in Connecticut. And interestingly, when you go on their websites, oftentimes they disguise their faces either with a mask or they blur out the photos of their members on their website. I mean, it's obviously very similar to the KKK, what they did. So they don't want to be recognized in their community because obviously they know that there's something not right about what they're doing.
Yeah, they want to pretend they're really proud.
Yes,
but they don't want you to know, just like the Klan. But we don't want
right.
you to know who we are. That's so proud, right?
Right.
And so they're then trying, basically a recruiting ground, trying to
yes.
get people to join up with these groups. And so I think it's important because a lot of things we've talked about last year, there's been real racist stuff that's happened in the last few years. And there's been stuff that have been false accusations about racism and things that some people might debate about, well, was that really a racist intent behind it, right? All that kind of, this is very clear and overt, right? There's no denying it. It's been reported in the mainstream media about, to your point, in a lot of towns having this.
Yes.
And so you guys, because you have the pre-existing relationships and infrastructure, if I can, you're able to respond to this pretty quickly.
We were, and we were able to do that. We immediately decided that we wanted to ask white speakers to speak. We wanted them to be across the political spectrum because we didn't want this to be seen as a liberal response or a conservative response. And so we did contact civic leaders and government leaders and spiritual leaders in Granby, and we asked them just to speak for 5 minutes. And so we had around 8 speakers at the Stop the Hate rally, And we were there for about 30 minutes. We also made available signs. We had them printed immediately, yard signs that says hate has no place in our town. And we put up around 200 of those signs around the town. And that day we had over 100 people show up for the rally. We did consult with local police, and they did advise us that they were a bit concerned because they had wanted to make sure that there were no, I guess you would call, agitators who would show up. And so they were a bit concerned, but it was there were no agitators that made themselves known that day. And it was just a great day to gather and to really say we stand for stopping the hate. Now, as a follower of Jesus, for me, all I had to do was lean on the words of Jesus that said, we're supposed to love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us. We're supposed to love our neighbors. And who are our neighbors? Well, they are our people, our friends and neighbors of color. And then Jesus said that the identifying mark of his followers would be that we would love one another. And so my message was distinctively Christian, but that was not everybody's message that day.
Yeah. And so what does a rally accomplish from your perspective? Because if I'm the skeptic, I'm going to say, you went out and talked for half an hour about it, a bad thing. What does that really do?
Yeah.
How do you think about it?
It does a couple of things, and you won't be surprised, but some of our leaders will say, well, this is really not a problem in Granby. And which, I politely said, no, it is a problem. In fact, in the 24 years that we've been here in Granby, we have seen other racist incidents in town. So we know it is that. And my own story is a story of being ignorant to what it's like to be a person of color. I mean, I grew up in a culture where I knew all the racial epithets. I unfortunately, they're still cataloged in my brain. I can't erase them. So I know what it's like to be racist and be in a racist culture. In fact, I would have told you until I became more aware of it, I had latent racism. And so I believe a rally like that exposes ignorance in a way that makes people think. I hope that it made our town leaders think, wow, if that's happening here, should I be concerned? And you can't just explain it away, as some wanted to do, but those were just people who came from outside of our community and distributed those flyers, because the reality is there's probably some connection in Granby. And from my own experience of living here, I know that that would be true. So it brings that awareness that it is going on in our midst. It brings evil out into light. And so it can't be hidden. It challenges our ignorant thinking to think that, okay, this is something that maybe I need to pay attention. And hopefully it would challenge somebody who's white to say, I should ask my Black friends or my Latino friends or my Asian friends, how do they feel about that? Yeah. The other thing that I would share with you is that, we've been told by both the FBI and the Anti-Defamation League, which was recently did a seminar here in Connecticut, that Connecticut itself has seen a rise over the past years of racist incidents like this, up over 115% than they were in prior years.
And so now you alluded to something I do want to come back to, okay, is this notion that you had mostly white speakers.
Yes.
And so now that was an intentional decision, and yes, we weren't trying to exclude people, but can you tell people the rationale behind how you got to that?
The rationale was very clear, because these white supremacists were recruiting men of European descent. And so we wanted white men to say, no, we stand against this. We stand against hate. And we believe that all people, regardless of the color of their skin, their nationality, their creed, their origin, are welcome in our town, and they're our neighbors and they're accepted here. And so we were not excluding people of color. We know how they feel based on our conversations with them about what happened. But we wanted to send a clear statement to anybody who has a white supremacist ideology that there are white men, particularly, as well as white women, who stand against this type of white supremacist culture.
And so are there, well, I want to mention just one other thing, because we were talking about this before we went on the air, is we're recording this weeks after the attacks in Israel.
Yes.
And we hear from our Jewish friends, rabbis, et cetera, about feeling alone, isolated, vulnerable, targets for people. And so did you hear some of that in this as well from now that this has happened in my neighborhood, from African Americans, from Latino, from other folks? Were they experiencing the same thing?
Yeah, definitely. It's it's theoretical until it becomes real, and so yes, there is a level of fear, a level of discontinuity now that something like this is actually happening. And then when you hear it's not isolated, that it's happening all over the region, then it becomes both it makes people afraid, but it also makes them angry and want to work for change.
Yeah, and I think that it's easy for folks to discount it and say, well, look, nothing's really happened, and the odds of it of something happening or somebody is very, very remote.
Yeah.
But if you flip it and say, if somebody starts distributing flyers, say kill the Christians,
yes,
right, we're going to feel very differently, right? Because now
Yes.
we're going to feel exposed and vulnerable.
Yes.
And so there's something significant, I think, for our friends across some of these divides to know they're not alone.
Yes.
Right. And so that's something else I think you guys were trying to step into.
Yes, definitely. It was very intentional. And, Valley Brook, I mean, this area is predominantly white. Our congregation is probably a little more diverse than the town. And, I saw in our members and attenders of color a connection between between me and them in the following weeks, because they said, oh, my pastor gets me. My pastor understands. I'm safe with my pastor.
And so how big did the rally end up being?
The last time I counted it, I'd gotten to over 110, and then I just stopped counting. So,
which for a little bedroom community like North Granby, that's pretty good. That's a pretty good turnout.
It is.
On a Saturday, on a nice fall Saturday, right?
Yes. Oh, it was a beautiful day. We candidly, we have been plagued with bad weather when we do events for Granby Racial Reconciliation. So this was a spectacular day.
Right.
I actually had planned to wear long sleeves and a sport coat, and it was too hot to do that.
Oh, wow. And so what do you have coming up? Are there any events planned, or is it? Go ahead.
Yes. Yeah. So we are, as we head toward the end of the year, there's nothing in 2023, but in January, we are already planning our Martin Luther King Day weekend. This coming summer, we're actually going to be partnering with the Greater Farmington Valley for our Juneteenth celebration. But we've decided to partner with a national movement called Amity movement, and it's a greater educational movement about explaining about racism and bringing people into a greater understanding of why we need to work together and connect. And so that's something new. I'm not heading that up for Granby Racial Reconciliation, so I'm not completely in all the know on what's going to happen with that. But we'll have those two events. One will be a greater event with the Greater Farmington Valley communities that have been doing Juneteenth celebrations, and then the Amity Day will be later than June, and that will be more of an educational movement.
You guys were in a great position to respond because you'd spent several years investing in relationship at the end of the day, right?
Yes.
And so as I think about the election that's coming up next year, we know it turned violent last time. And had the other side won, everybody expected it was going to turn violent. And so I think there's a good chance this turns violent this time. And so more of us need to be building these relationships so that the church can respond,
Yes.
whether it's just the church or working with others, but the church can respond in helpful ways because we're supposed to be peacemakers, not exacerbators of the tension.
That's right.
And so how did you guys get started? Did you just pick up the phone one day and call someone? Did someone call you? Was it, how did you get started? Because other people might want to try and emulate it.
Yes, we started very simply by, well, it was in the middle of the pandemic, so we started having Zoom meetings, and that is still, we meet monthly, and we discuss our agenda. We've had to we had to become a nonprofit organization, a 501c3 organization. We also had to raise funds because we're putting on the Juneteenth celebration. We were hiring bands and food vendors and those kinds of things. And so it really has become quite an effort, but it started by meeting together and telling our stories and listening to one another and asking questions and doing the hard work of really paying attention to other people's stories and their happy times and their sad times.
Yeah, there's listening is an act of love in our society because we don't even listen to each other.
Yes.
But listening, it's important in that stuff, as I've learned in some of the stuff we've done, is you don't get to tell me it's not my story. It's my story, right?
Yeah.
But we'll discount it, and we feel it's important to say what I disagree on, as opposed to just hear the story.
Yes.
Hear that person, which I know you guys invested in. But to get to even that, did somebody just send out an email and say, "Hey guys, why don't we get together and start doing this?" How did that first step happen? Because that's probably the hardest thing for folks to think about.
Honestly, it started because my friend Ken Monin and I, before the pandemic began, we had started working through Latasha Morrison's book, Be the Bridge. And so we had been bringing together white congregation members and Black congregation members and walking through the Be the Bridge book, as well as the recommended readings and videos with that. And so we had already created a culture of learning from one another. And that we were probably on our second Be the Bridge group when the pandemic started, and we continued those. And so we already had that going on. And then it was just a natural segue to sort of bring that to the pastors to say, we need to respond to what happened here in Minneapolis. And so that was really what we decided to do to begin that process.
Well, Clark, thank you for doing it. Thank you for your ministry. Thanks for being such a key part of this reconciliation. We're given the word of reconciliation, Scripture tells us.
Yes,
thanks for doing that. Thanks for your ministry. And thanks for sharing it with our audience.
Well, thank you for inviting me on.
Thanks. I'd also like to thank our producer, Jess Mangano, and listeners like you. This program is created by Vision New England, which accelerates evangelism by helping the church make disciples, do justice, foster unity, to share Jesus. You can find more resources at visionnewengland.org. This program is brought to you by our friends at the Luis Palau Association, who are dedicated to proclaiming the good news, uniting the church, and impacting cities worldwide.